Okay, we have a quorum and a good amount of attendees have already joined us. So I think in the interest of using our time wisely today and covering the most that we can, let's go ahead and get started. So once again, I'll introduce myself. I'm Robert Gibbons, the Director of Education at CalNonprofits. And today our webinar is Understanding the California Budget. And we're so lucky to have Laura Pryor and Scott Graves from the California Budget Center joining us today. So I'll move along to the next slide. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. I imagine a lot of this is very familiar to folks. And I can see that everyone is using the chat well. We'll also be using the Q&A box, and this is where you can submit your questions during the presentation. And if we're not able to answer those questions as they come up, there is a question and answer session at the end of our program, and we'll address those questions there. Additionally, there's a closed captioning feature. And so if you click on that CC button at the bottom of your Zoom platform, you'll be able to receive closed captioning provided to us by AI Media. We're so grateful that they can join us as well. Next slide, please. A quick plug for membership for CalNonprofits. Today, we're really lucky to offer this webinar for free to all members of the community. However, many of our presentations do include a fee. And so by joining CalNonprofits, you'll alleviate yourself of that fee and also avail yourself to many of the membership benefits that we offer. You can learn more about those membership benefits at calnonprofits.org. I also want to make a quick plug. We're right now offering a 15% discount for new members with the code MEM24. I'll note this again at the end of our webinar and also include that information in the presentation wrap-up. So just as a note, all registrants will receive a recording of the presentation, the transcript, as well as the PowerPoint slides that we're referencing today. With that, I'd also like to invite CalNonprofit CEO Jeff Green to join us to talk a little bit about CalNonprofits and the different ways that we engage with the nonprofit community.
Thank you, Robert, and welcome everybody. Good morning. Glad to see you all here, or at least know you're all here, read that you're all here. So yeah, I have the pleasure of serving as CEO of California Association of Nonprofits, better known as CalNonprofits. And the reason we're doing this today, and we are going to turn this program over to our friends at the California Budget and Policy Center in just a moment, but we want to make sure that everyone's clear. I know we're joining us from all over the state, from all different sectors, geographies, sizes of organizations. But CalNonprofits at a headline level, really, we're here to build a more powerful and politically engaged nonprofit sector. Nonprofits carry the goodwill of the majority of us around the state. We are the most trusted sector. We do a lot of good work. We're often solving problems, but we don't always exercise our full power. And so that's one of the things that CalNonprofits is committed to helping nonprofits do that. So we do it through advocacy, through education, through research. And today we're going to talk about one of the most important tools for our advocacy, and of course that is money. We are very much attuned to what is happening in our public sector. We are a big partner to all manner of public sector agencies at a local level, state level, federal level. But really budgets and how they are crafted and what they ultimately say a lot about our values. This is about us exerting our values and asserting our values to our state legislators in particular in this case. But talking about where we believe those dollars need to flow and what we as a community, as a society, as a state need to be paying attention to. And we all know that if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. And that is what we are trying to help our friends and neighbors and colleagues get, is to that table. And sometimes we have to build that table and create the table ourselves. So what we're trying to do is offer some resources here, some expertise into the amazing sausage making process that is the California state budget. Give folks some tools to not only understand it, but ultimately to impact it. And for those of you that don't track these kinds of data, when we do our reports like Causes Count, one of the things we look at is what are those revenue sources to our sector. And the public sector is the second largest. So earned revenue is the first largest sector into the nonprofits of our state, and the second biggest is partnerships, and that's state grants and contracts with the public sector. So it matters very much. It matters differently to different folks. And of course, we're looking at this also through an equity lens. Where are those dollars flowing? Are they getting to where they're most needed, where they can do the most good? Are they addressing inequities, whether we're talking about race, gender, geography, age, you name it, under-resourced communities? And so that's what we depend on each other as the nonprofit community to do. And the more we know, and the better we can influence those public dollars and how they are spent, the better. So, speech over. I am going to introduce our panel and talk a little bit about, well, I'm not going to talk much at all from here on. Actually, I'm just going to help answer questions. But I want to say that we're very happy to have both Scott Graves, who is the budget director of the California Budget and Policy Center, and Laura Pryor, who is the research director. So we've got the top research, the top budget folks here to answer questions and present. So we're going to turn the majority of today's program over to Laura. I've seen Laura present more than once. She's fabulous in helping folks to understand how this budget works and to advocate for our sector as well. So with no further ado, the microphone is yours, Laura.
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you everybody for having me today. Good morning. I am so excited to be here to present our Dollars and Democracy, an Introduction to the State Budget Process presentation. As Jeff mentioned, my name is Laura Pryor, and I am the Research Director at the California Budget and Policy Center. For those of you not familiar with the Budget Center, we are a nonprofit that does research and analysis on our state budget, which is what I am here to talk to you about today. Next slide. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of, as Jeff said, how the sausage is made, I wanted to take a step back and just talk about why budgets matter. So at the Budget Center, we like to say that budgets are statements of our values and priorities as Californians. So for example, if we value and prioritize the people and populations that you all focus on in your work, we should see that prioritized in our state budget. Next slide. And overall, it's critical to remember that our budget choices affect all Californians. So again, for example, if our administration chooses to reduce funding for childcare, we are going to see ripple effects of that budget decision across communities in California. Next slide. So high level, again, why budgets matter. At the heart of it, budget choices answer the question, what kind of a California do we want to live in? Next slide. So we're going to unpack that today and talk about our state budget process, talk about the 24-25 budget and what's next. So specifically, I'll start by highlighting some key facts about the budget and the overall budget process. Then I'll go into the 24-25 budget, specifically thinking about where things landed fiscally, where things landed with key programs and policies. And then from there, I'll highlight a few implications for our 2025-26 budget. Next slide. So beginning with those key facts about the state budget. Next slide. I like to start by thinking about what are the funds that go into our state budget. And the key thing to know here is that our state budget is made up of two main sources, state funds and federal funds. Next slide. So of those state funds and federal funds, about 2/3 of our budget consists of state funds. So those bluish parts of the donut chart you see here, and about 1/3 of our state budget is comprised of federal funds. So that teal part of the donut chart that you see here. So big picture, state funds account for more than 2/3 of our state budget. Next slide. So drilling in a bit more on those state budget revenues, primarily we see those coming from three sources. And that's first, the personal income tax, so the taxes that we all pay in April. Second, the sales and use tax. So those are taxes on tangible goods with exceptions for things like groceries and medicine. And then lastly, our corporation tax, so taxes on business income. So the personal income tax, sales and use tax, and corporation tax are really those main drivers of revenue on that state side of our overall budget. So keep in mind then that when we're seeing fluctuations in these three revenue sources, we are likely to see fluctuations in the amount of money in our state budget overall. So keep that in mind when we talk about the 24-25 budget, because that is a key point to remember. Next slide. So the other point I want to make about key facts about the state budget, it's just reminding folks that while the decisions are made in Sacramento, our state budget provides funding to communities across the state. Next slide. So with that, I'm going to get into some details on the actual state budget process, how the sausage is made. So the key players in the state budget process are, next slide. First, our governor, Gavin Newsom, who took office January 2019 and is currently in his second and final term. Secondly, going into that middle column, we have the legislature represented here by our two legislative leaders who are pretty new to the job on both ends. So on our Senate end, we have Mike McGuire, our president pro tem of the state Senate. He started February 2024. On the Assembly side, we have Robert Rivas, Speaker of the State Assembly. He started fall 2023. So collectively, the governor, our Senate lead, and our Assembly lead, we think of them as the big three because of the pivotal role that they play in budget negotiations each year. And last but not least, very important to include on this slide is the public. So Californians, you all, advocates, community members, play a really pivotal role in our budget process, which I'll talk more about later on in this presentation. Next slide. A few other folks that I wanted to call out in terms of key players are the additional legislators and the Legislative Analyst's Office. So legislators also play a key role in our budget process. They review and revise the governor's proposals and add new proposals with the help of our LAO, Legislative Analyst's Office. So the key players in that group are the leads of the budget committee. So on the Senate side, that is Scott Wiener, chair of the Senate Budget and Fiscal Review Committee. On the Assembly side, that is Assembly member Jesse Gabriel, chair of the Assembly Budget Committee. And for the LAO, that's Gabe Pettick, who leads a team that provides nonpartisan fiscal and policy advice to the legislator. So each budget committee has several subcommittees that focus on a specific set of policy areas like education, health and human services. They talk and debate about the governor's proposal and overall play a key role in our budget process. Next slide. And then going back to the public, so you all, Californians, members of the public can make their voices heard during the budget process, as I mentioned earlier. So now I'm going to get into a few key ways that advocates and community members can get involved in our state budget process. Next slide. So as shown here, the public's role can include a variety of different ways, but the two areas we wanted to specifically call out, which will be helpful to keep in mind as we go through our next slides, is first writing letters of support or opposition, so submitting written testimony and delivering those letters via email or through the Assembly and Senate online portals. Secondly, members of the public can go to those budget committee hearings and attend the hearings in person, and then at key moments testify. So go up to the mic and address the legislator and express support or opposition for a specific proposal in the state budget. So these are just a few key ways for the public to have a say in budget decisions. Next slide. But at the heart of the matter is influencing budget decisions ultimately requires building relationships with policymakers and their staff. So to a large extent, influencing budget decisions is really about building familiarity and trust over time with key players in the process. So it's not very reasonable to think that advocates can just parachute in out of nowhere and get access to very busy staffers, very busy legislators, and other officials, and just expect for their priorities to be heard. It takes time to build those relationships and get to know those staffers, legislators, administration officials, so that your priorities and advocates' priorities can be heard in our budget process. So what that means is that advocates need to lay the groundwork for influence through their constant attention to their relationships with key players in the budget process, both in the legislature and the governor's administration. So to recap here, Californians, they can make their voices heard through areas like written testimony and public in-person testimony, but really it's building those relationships with policymakers and key staff is the key area that's likely to influence budget and policy choices. Next slide. So with that said, I want to go into talking about our state budget timeline. And before talking about key dates, the first thing I want to say is that the state budget process is cyclical. And there's no clear stop or start dates with our budget process. In other words, there is no off season for our state budget. Someone in Sacramento is always thinking about or working on the state budget. And because budget decisions are made throughout the year, that means there's also opportunities for budget advocacy during all phases of the budget process, which I'll get into in the subsequent slides. Next slide. But first, just taking a step back overall and thinking about those key players, it's important to know that the governor, so currently Gavin Newsom, he has the lead role, the governor has the lead role in crafting the budget. So what does this mean? Next slide. There are some key dates to keep in mind that revolve around the governor's decision-making. So first, the governor has his first say at the budget in January when he releases his proposed budget on January 10th. So that's the first key date. And that's his first take on where those values and priorities lie in our overall budget decision-making. Then after January, as mentioned, there's those budget committees and budget subcommittees meet and deliberate and talk about the governor's proposal. And then by May 14th, the governor has his second bite at the apple, where he takes into consideration the updated fiscal outlook, as well as what those legislators and the public were saying earlier in those budget hearings, and produces a revised budget on May 14th, what we call the May revise. And then from there, there's more conversation between legislators and the administration. And by the end of June, we typically have our enacted state budget. And so overall, big picture, we see the governor's decision-making primarily coming into play in that January 10th when he's releasing the proposed budget, again at the May revise, and then a signed budget by the end of June. Next slide. So let's break this down a bit more, given what I said that the budget is a year-round cyclical process. So let's start with what's going on in that July to December period. So the time period after the budget has already been signed, which is the moment we are in right now. So at this time, most of the budget work is happening behind the scenes. So if you have relationships with officials or staff in the governor's administration, this is a good time to try to get your priorities in the governor's January proposal and really start building those relationships, which I talked about in earlier slides. So legislative leaders during this time are also developing their own priorities for that upcoming budget year, again, knowing that that proposed budget drops January 10th. So they often release some budget blueprints in the fall that outline their top priorities for the upcoming year. So during this time, advocates can build or use their existing relationships with legislators and their staff to have their priorities included and to suggest topics for those budget hearings. Next slide. So that leads us to the January to mid-May. So after that pre-thinking is done, after advocates have been working on building those relationships, we see the action during the January to mid-May period being much more public, with opportunities to react to the governor's proposals and testify at those legislative budget hearings. So as I noted earlier, the governor is required to propose a budget by January 10th. So during this time, advocates can weigh in on the governor's proposals. Advocates also can schedule meetings with folks in the administration to provide feedback on the proposed budget and help shape their thinking around the May revision. Those budget subcommittees, so again, led by Senator Scott Wiener, Assemblymember Jesse Gabriel, then hold hearings to review the governor's proposals and begin crafting the Assembly and Senate versions of the budget. So during this time, this is a great opportunity for advocates to get their views and ideas in front of legislators. Next slide. So that takes us to mid-May to June. So this mid-May to June period is very fast-paced, but despite that, there are still a few opportunities to get involved by testifying at hearings and meeting with legislators and their staff. So the signature event of this period is the release of the May revision, which updates the governor's proposed budget from January. And there really only are 3 weeks after that May revision before the legislator has to finalize the budget bill that must be passed by June 15th. So ultimately, given that that's a very short timeline, it really comes down to those big 3 that I mentioned in an earlier slide. So again, the governor and the leaders of the Assembly and the Senate to negotiate the final outlines of the budget package and then sign it by the end of June. So overall, that is the timeline / budget process. And I'm hoping that gave you a sense of not only those key facts and what the general outline looks like, but maybe helps get your wheels turning given the moment we're in right now around what we all can do to get ourselves involved with budget advocacy currently and in the coming fiscal year. Next slide. So with that background, I want to transition to talking about how things landed with our 24-25 enacted budget. It was a very dynamic budget cycle in the first half of the year. So let's get into it. Next slide. So first, I want to talk about where things landed fiscally. So looking at this slide, I'm going to take us back to that January 10th moment when Governor Gavin Newsom first released the proposed budget. At that time, he was saying that the projected deficit was at $37.9 billion. That's a lot. And then to add to that, between that January and that May revision period, the amount of money that the administration had projected in terms of revenues fell short to about the tune of $7 billion. So that added an additional $7 billion on top of that $37.9 billion to our budget problem. Given that this was such a sizable deficit, the legislator and the administration decided to pass what's called an early action budget package before the budget was signed. And this decision essentially took off those low-hanging fruit decisions of what could be cut, delayed, and deferred to add solutions to our state budget, so that the legislator and the administration could focus on those harder conversations come June. So that took about $17.3 billion off the table, so away from our budget problem. So come May revise of last year, the governor was projecting a deficit of around $27.6 billion. And what we saw in the final budget largely reflects this fiscal outlook. However, the total deficit that was cited in our final budget package was named at $46.8 billion. Again, that is a very large number. Next slide. And some of you might be wondering, how did we get here? Didn't we just have a budget surplus not too long ago? Yes, we did, but we are currently facing a sizable deficit, or did so in the past budget cycle. And, to sum up why and how we got here, this shortfall really reflects steep stock market declines in 2022 after a period of record growth in 2020 and 2021, which lowered those income tax collections from high-income Californians and corporations. So if you remember from those donut charts where I talked about how the personal income tax, sales and use tax, corporation tax were really main drivers of our state budget overall, what happened was that steep stock market decline in 2022 resulted in lower revenues coming from our tax collections, which contributed to our state budget deficit from this past fiscal year. And the key thing to know is that the extent of this revenue drop only became clear later on than normal because the IRS pushed the filing deadline for the 2022 tax year from April 2023 to November 2023, because I'm sure as many of you felt very viscerally, there were floods, storms, a lot of really extreme weather events in 2023 that delayed those tax collections. So what that meant is come, April, May, June, typically when the administration has more information about the amount of money coming in through tax collections, they didn't have that information, and they didn't have it until much later in the year. So the administration was making decisions based off of a limited set of fiscal information, which ultimately resulted in higher projections than what actually came in. And that is largely how we ended up in the situation we were earlier this year with the deficit. There were a few other factors that contributed, such as the economic dampening effects of the Federal Reserve's interest rate hikes. But to sum up, this is how we got to the deficit we saw from the 24-25 budget cycle. Next slide. So breaking down, the actual implications of this. So unlike the federal budget, the state has to have a balanced budget. So we cannot run a deficit. So that number you saw on the previous slide of more than 40 billion, we can't just have that exist in our budget. We have to solve for it. So the administration has solved for that in a few key ways. So first, those bluish rows that you see on this table represent more or less budget maneuvers that were used to solve the deficit. So namely through adding additional revenue and doing some internal borrowing and also drawing on some reserves. However, the biggest share of solutions came from those tan color rows, which reflect cuts, delays, and deferrals, which, as mentioned, was the largest share of solutions for solving our budget problem. And as you can imagine, this led to a lot of debate among the legislator and the administration, particularly during those budget hearings, where hard decisions were made regarding which programs to cut, delay, defer to help solve the budget problem. So going into this chart a bit more, next slide. First, I want to talk about those bluish bars from the previous slide. So where things landed with adding revenue and reserves. So with regards to adding revenue, the administration did this in a few key ways. First, through limiting the tax credits businesses can use to 5 million. And secondly, through suspending tax deductions for prior year losses or net operating losses, NOLs, for businesses with at least 1 million in profit. So these two actions raised revenue that went into our state budget. Also, we drew on reserves. So, to some extent, it's natural to see the fluctuations that we're seeing in our state budget. And to help account for those fluctuations, we have built up these reserves to draw on to help in times where we have that deficit. So as a result, the budget did reject many of the harmful cuts to critical services by drawing on those reserves, and namely, the budget took around half of the funds from the Budget Stabilization Account, or the BSA, our rainy day fund. But one point of, a real pain point for a lot of advocates was that the administration did decide to drain all the funds from our safety net reserve, which is our reserve that's meant to protect folks that are supported by CalWORKs during times of a recession. So because all of those funds were drawn from, this has left no dedicated funding to help support CalWORKs and Medi-Cal in future years. Next slide. So with regards to those tan parts of the chart, so the cuts, delays, and deferrals, there's a few key points that I wanted to uplift, namely, largely because of Prop 98, which is our guaranteed minimum funding for public schools. In our state budget, we did see protected funding for TK, so transitional kindergarten through 14, through community colleges, public schools. Regarding the safety net, we did see cuts to various CalWORK services, including the expanded subsidized employment and home visiting programs. Regarding housing and homelessness, there were cuts to critical affordable housing, homeownership, and homelessness programs, though not as extreme as what was proposed in January and May. We did still see some cuts in the final budget. With regards to health, the budget did preserve the expansion of Medi-Cal eligibility to undocumented adults ages 26 to 49, as well as the in-home supportive services for undocumented Californians. Again, these were things that were in jeopardy earlier in the earlier proposals, but the final budget did preserve them. And lastly, I did want to mention that the final budget did include funding for survivors of domestic violence, among other crimes, namely through backfilling federal VOCA funding, which many advocates are really heartened to see in our final budget. So that provides a sense of where things landed in our fiscal year 2024-25 budget. Next slide. And now I want to take a minute and look ahead to what we might expect for the 2025-26 budget. So in this moment, mid-September, it's still too soon to be doing really meaningful fiscal projections, but I wanted to share a few factors on the horizon that may influence the budget in the next year and subsequent years to keep in mind. Next slide. So namely, I want to talk about a few key propositions. So the election that we have in November that I'm sure is top of everybody's mind. So there are a few key propositions that we'll be voting on come November that may or may not influence our state budget. So the first one that I wanted to mention is Proposition 36, which would increase penalties for several drug and theft crimes. So if passed, this proposition would significantly drive up state prison costs, cut funding for behavioral health treatment and other critical services, as well as potentially push more Californians into homelessness. So if passed, Proposition 36 would roll back the policies enacted by Proposition 47. And as you can see in this chart, Proposition 47 has repurposed close to $1 billion. So if the California voters choose to pass Proposition 36, there will likely be additional strain on our state budget in the coming years. Next slide. The other proposition I wanted to mention is Proposition 35, which has to do with the Managed Care Organization Tax, or the MCO tax. So at a high level, the MCO tax provides California with federal dollars that the state has historically had flexibility with how to use. So if passed, Proposition 35 would ensure that those federal dollars went to certain healthcare investments. So there are implications of this that I wanted to share. So namely, it would lock in spending decisions in the future, which would impact how Californians engage with the state budget process. So advocates and community leaders would have less opportunity to weigh in on how the state resources should be allocated, because the MCO tax spending decisions would be constrained by the ballot measure. So at the moment, Californians can't contribute to conversations about how that MCO tax revenue should be spent during the budget process via those public hearings and meeting with legislators that we went over in previous slides. So the bottom line here to know in relation to the budget is that if Proposition 35 passes, the state will have less flexibility with how to allocate those billions of dollars we get through the MCO tax in our state budget. Next slide. The last point I want to make doesn't directly relate to our state budget, but it uplifts some recent work that we have done at the Budget Center that highlights the landscape of gender disparities in our state. So this tool is called the Women's Wellbeing Index, which you can access via this QR code or the link you see on the screen. And overall, this tool paints a picture of how women are faring in California across all 58 counties. And we do this by analyzing 30 indicators of well-being. So you can use this tool to understand how women are faring in, say, Sacramento County or Sonoma County or any of the counties in California by downloading a fact sheet that shows you the scores for all 30 indicators. You can also see how women are doing across the state for individual indicators. So for example, we have an indicator highlighting mental health. You can download the mental health fact sheet and see how women across all 58 counties are faring for mental health. Next slide. So how does this relate to our state budget? So regardless of how you use this tool, what this data shows is that gender disparities continue to exist across California. So in this slide, you see all of the indicators where we're seeing women faring worse than men. And I show this to say that our state has a long way to go to remedy the gender and racial inequities that exist. And as mentioned at the very top of our presentation, budgets are statements of our values and priorities as Californians. And I point out this tool to say that there are still incredible challenges that we have to tackle in California, and our state budget process has a key role in solving these issues. Next slide. So what can policymakers do, you might be wondering? So to close, I want to share a few key points that we highlight at the Budget Center. So in order to make meaningful long-term investments in programs that serve Californians with the greatest needs in the long run, close those gender and racial disparities in California, the state will need equitable and permanent new revenue streams, which could be obtained through fair taxation and prison closures. So as you see on this chart, the Legislative Analyst's Office, the LAO, estimates that the state could safely close 5 prisons to permanently stop paying for empty prison beds and reduce wasteful spending by as much as $1 billion annually ongoing. So while our final enacted budget from this past year, the 24-25 budget, did avoid many harmful cuts that were proposed earlier in this year, state leaders, they have tools and resources to prevent these disastrous cuts and make progress in the long run. And folks can do this or state policymakers can do this by permanently reducing tax breaks for profitable corporations to ensure that they paid their fair share, and by advancing a plan to close more prisons and through that, we can avoid those cuts to services that Californians rely on, despite potentially another budget deficit or whatever fiscal outlook we see in the coming years. Next slide. So to close, I want to acknowledge that was a lot of information, a lot of details, a lot that was thrown at you. Our website, calbudgetcenter.org, has a number of resources for you all to learn more about not only our state budget process, but just the key populations and priorities that we have at the Budget Center that we hope help make progress to solve these disparities that we clearly still have in our state. So thank you so much, and I will transition us to some Q&A.
Thank you so much, Laura. That if we could all see you in real room, we'd give you a hand. That was a packed presentation, and we appreciate it. I've been watching for specific questions. I think what I'd like to do is dig into some of the things you actually mentioned already, and we can invite Scott on as he is able and interested in chiming in here. You mentioned, actually, you closed on this, and that is sort of California's dependence on high earners. And I think it's probably important for everyone to understand just how dependent we are and why these budget swings are so big in California. It's certainly, we're not unique, but we're certainly at the far end of the spectrum if you look across the country. So can you comment a little bit more about sort of what that relationship is? You mentioned earlier on that, stock market performance is one piece of the puzzle, and certainly tax policy is another. But just how dependent are we on high earners and the wealthiest Californians when it comes to our overall budget?
Sure. I feel like I've talked a lot, so I can pass to Scott for this one, but
Sure.
just say that, we have a large tech sector in our state, and certainly what's happening in the tech sector with IPOs and whatnot influences the amount of revenue we're getting into our state budget, which accounts for some of the recent fluctuations that we saw in our 24-25 budget. And I'll pass to Scott to say more.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Laura, for such an incredible presentation. And thank you for this question. This is, of course, one that's always on Californians' minds related to revenue swings. I think it's really important to understand, and what we like to emphasize is the extreme and growing levels of inequality in our state. Of course, this is nothing new. This has been going on for decades. The reality is that most of the benefits of productivity and economic growth in our state have been going to the very tippy top of the income spectrum. I mean, we're not even talking the top 1%. We're talking the top much less than 1%. And the reality is that's where the money is. Until we solve income inequality in California and have a more equitable distribution of income, if we want to adequately and robustly fund public services, we need to go to where the money is without overburdening those at the lower ends of the income spectrum. So the fact that we have relatively few Californians who are taking in most of the wealth of our state and most of the income means that when you have a progressive income tax structure like we do, they are naturally going to pay more relative to other Californians simply because they have more. You may see other states that make different decisions about that, right? If you were in Texas, you might see middle and lower income families paying much larger percentages of their incomes in taxes. That's not the way we've decided to do it in California. Now, add on that the reality, the realization that policymakers came to after the Great Recession, led by Jerry Brown and members of the Assembly, that yes, that does create volatility within our income tax structure. No one is hiding or running from that fact. The solution to that is, during the really good years, to take some of that income off the top and direct it into reserves, so that when we inevitably hit the economic slowdowns and revenue downturns, we have some money in the piggy bank that we have set aside in order to cushion the blow and be able to fund services through the tough times. And that is exactly what we have done and what we have seen play out in California. So we would consider that a huge policy success. The fact that California voters in 2014 were asked to pass Proposition 2, put on the ballot by Governor Brown and the legislature, to strengthen our reserve policies. And we see the benefits of that this year, because while there were some spending reductions, Laura mentioned them, there were also we were also able to dip into our reserves and offset the need for cuts or tax increases. So we see that as a huge benefit. Now, I'll just say one more thing. For anyone who doesn't like the fact that we tax the wealthy in California pretty well, you only have two answers, right? If you don't want to do that, you basically have two choices. One is you can decide you want the same level of services, but you want middle income and lower income Californians to pay higher taxes to make up the difference for what we're not going to ask the wealthiest to pay. Or you can say, actually, we just want to cut taxes on the wealthy. We also don't want anyone else to pay anything more. And now we've created a huge hole in our state budget, and we need to decide how to close that in order to bring spending down to the level of revenues we say we're willing to raise from California. So none of these choices are easy. We believe that California has made the right choice by having a progressive tax system. We also believe that we should also be doing more to more equitably raise revenues in order to make the investments we need, and so that all Californians can thrive. Sorry for the kind of lengthy answer there, but this is one of those ones where if you give a short answer, sometimes there can be misunderstandings about where it's going.
I really appreciate that, Scott. You know, our former controller used to lead her presentations with that and say, do you realize that California depends on, and she would have a number, 1,100 individual taxpayers for X% of the budget. And that always has struck me as something that folks need to understand it, to really navigate this. We have a question, and this is, of course, just happened yesterday, and that was the Fed's decision to, for the first time in 4 years, cut the federal funds rate by a 0.5 percentage point. And the question is, what effect might that have downstream? Obviously, we're 24 hours into that, and it's a relatively small cut, big for the Fed, but relatively small overall. But any comments on the interplay between the federal funds rate and budgets?
It's hard to tell when someone's looking at you on Zoom, but I think Laura was looking at me. So, I mean, we're certainly not claiming any expertise here. I mean, I think a lot of this is the goal of this rate cut is to boost economic growth, right? Make it easier for folks to borrow, to invest, to buy homes, to buy furniture for those homes. So to the extent that this succeeds in increasing economic activity, that is a plus for our state budget, for our revenue system. At the same time, if the stock market reacts favorably to all of this, that's also a plus, because where we are seeing the stock market play into our revenue stream, as Laura mentioned, is through our personal income tax structure and the capital gains portion of our personal income tax. So when the stock market is doing well, California's revenue system is doing very well. So those portend good news for the state budget. But I think, as Laura said, we never really know. We're not making any predictions here. I will say we do have a data point here. The Department of Finance recently reported that state general fund revenues are about $1 billion, running ahead of projections by about $1 billion for the current fiscal year. Now, keep in mind, that was just for the month of July. We were 1 month into our current fiscal year, and they said, hey, we thought revenues would come in here. They actually came in $1 billion higher. That's a good place to be. You got an extra billion that you didn't anticipate, but that doesn't mean we're going to have a trend in which we see revenues coming in higher than projected all the way till January. So we have to wait to see.
Appreciate that. Laura, you did a fabulous job of just sharing the sort of the current play-by-play of how this all works out. And I'm curious if you have a comment on the relative power. The governor has the power and privilege to set the terms of the conversation in January with the initial budget. But of course, the legislature can go whatever direction it wants. What does that interplay look like in those intervening months before we get to that June deadline? this year maybe relative to past years or just in general, the governor has certain powers, but ultimately it is the legislature that has to pass a budget. Do you have any comment on sort of that power relationship and where the pressure points are for advocates to weigh in, either with the governor or the committees that we mentioned?
Certainly. So as mentioned, we did see some very devastating proposed cuts this past year in January and May, and particularly in the safety net space. And we saw some real legislative champions that said no. And they listened to the advocates that they're in close communication with. They asked really hard questions to the administration in our budget committee hearings and subcommittee hearings that put pressure, I think, on the administration. And when the legislator came out with their joint agreement by June 15th, it rejected so many of those proposed cuts. And while the final negotiations happened behind the scenes, I'm pretty confident saying that those champions really pushed through a final budget that saved so many of those proposed disastrous cuts. So while the governor has the final say, it's really important to make sure that folks have those relationships with those legislative champions, because it does make a difference, as we saw in this past budget cycle.
It'll probably be interesting for some of the folks on the call today. Those that have been involved in this budget may remember a time before this particular framework. And of course, I think it's important for Californians to know that it wasn't always this way. So the current budget process that Laura outlined has come into being in recent years, but it wasn't until 1970 that we had that June deadline. And that was passed by proposition, as so much in California is. And it wasn't until 2010, and I remember some of these conversations. I don't remember the 1970 conversations. I do remember the conversations about how often the legislature would miss that deadline and how we would start fiscal years with no budget in place. Certain spending would be frozen, and it became really a crisis all the way through the last financial meltdown. And so in 2010, we actually punished legislators for the first time and said, if you don't pass a budget by the date and get it to the governor's desk, you don't get paid. And amazing how well that worked. I want to say that was really a populist uprising in many ways. That was the voters of California saying we need to have a budget and a plan in place. And so it also, if I recall, and Scott or Laura, you may correct me, but I believe that was also the same piece. That was, I think, Prop 25 that made for the 50% plus one budget passage margin, as opposed to the 2/3 budget, which was part of the reason that California had always gotten stuck in some of those earlier debates. So, the underlying lesson here may be that whatever you may think about California doing a lot of legislating by ballot initiative, but that in some cases, the shape and size of how we make our budgets actually can be very much impacted by public feedback.
I was just going to add on, that's a really good point. And we as an organization are going to be going all in on what sounds really dry and boring, which is constitutional and statutory rules, because that is really where the rubber meets the road, right? If your state constitution, like ours, contains a number of constraints that make it harder for policymakers to do their jobs, including raising revenues where necessary, then we're not going to be able to provide the level of services that Californians expect from us. So these are long-term fights, right? And they're big fights. It's not like our organization is the only one who's going to be doing this work, but that's where it's really important, especially like for all the nonprofits represented on the call today, to understand that some of what Laura was walking through earlier and, around the rules of the process, that is so critical to make sure that you have the right rules, because if you impose constraints on yourself, you just limit your ability to do good for California and create the kind of state that we all want to see.
The budget initiative, the initiative process in general in California, of course, gets talked a lot about do we do too much? Does the legislature pass off hard decisions to the voters too often, or how much should we legislate in this fashion? You mentioned Prop 35 and 36. I'm wondering if you can comment on this. Some been saying shenanigans this year, the budget shenanigans of this particular year, but how much the bond tool gets used to fill gaps. If the budget can't solve it, how often we're passing things over to public debt and bond measure to solve a problem. And I think the climate bond, which we're going to see, if you look at what's in that, a lot of that were promises made or commitments made or insinuated previously that got stripped out of the budget and now are over in a bond. And I wonder if you can comment on that, that process and that balance, and how maybe even how often that happens.
I can start by saying that it's something that happens in multiple issue areas. So for example, in the education space, there was a prior commitment to paying for expanding and improving preschool, full day preschool, kindergarten facilities. And that was cut with the suggestion that that be added to the education facilities bond measure. So in addition to climate, we see it in areas like education with facilities as well as housing, where we have these more infrastructure related needs. And I would pass to Scott for any additional comment on that.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. A couple points I would make. One is you mentioned there are a couple of so there are 10 measures on the November ballot, and 2 of them were placed on the legislature as each of them is a $10 billion bond, right? So yeah, as Laura said, one relates to schools, another relates to what's generally thought of as climate. And bonds, just to keep in mind, they make sense when you want to make an investment for the long term and you don't want to dip into a single year's budget in order to pay for that. So it's sort of akin to buying a house. Relatively few people can buy a house outright, put 500K down on the table or more and say, I've bought the house. That's why you borrow money. It's a long-term investment. You're going to pay it back with interest over time. Bonds work the same way. So the question for voters is, do we need these things? Is this a priority we want to set as a state? And are we willing to have these additional costs on the general fund over time as we pay the interest back in order to borrow the money to support these long-term investments? Second point, on ballot measures generally, in recent years, they have very much become a negotiating tool used by special interests. Not that they don't want to get these things on the ballot, but they know that if they collect the signatures they need to qualify a measure for the ballot, that allows them to go to the legislature and governor and basically say, this thing is going on the ballot unless you have a better deal for us by June 30th, right? In these even numbered years, it's going to be around the end of June, which is the last opportunity to pull off a measure for November that has already qualified. So that's why we've started to see over the last few years these heated negotiations popping up in June around the same time they're trying to do the budget around, is the legislature going to craft some kind of compromise that's going to please the proponents of a ballot measure enough that they will take it off the ballot and take the legislative solution as opposed to going to the voters. So it's a whole different level of strategy that's been going on since the state, it was about a decade ago that the state implemented this new rule allowing ballot measures to come off. I think it's like, I don't remember, the 130, 150 days before the election, you can take it off. It used to be, no, once it qualifies, it's on, you can't get it off. Now it's, you can take it off. And then it's a matter of what is the legislature and governor willing to give up or compromise on if they want a measure to come off the ballot. And we saw that happen on several measures just a couple of months ago.
Right. And of course, that the same thing always happens within legislative. You had the Google AI deal where it was going to be a new text on some of the tech companies for journalism that they hadn't created, but were making money off of, and it ended up in a settlement. So yeah, it was a fascinating year for any who watched it. So a couple of questions that we have in the chat. I just want to do some quick ones here I want to throw out. One is the budget chairs. So the chairs are selected obviously by the legislature. What are the chances that the budget chairs remain the same into the next legislative session? I have my answer for that, but I'm curious if either of you would like to. I would say likely. We have a new speaker and a new pro tem, so they're likely to keep leadership at committees solid. But of course, there will be new sitting legislators. So anything can happen. But if I were a betting man, I would say the chairs will remain into the 25, 26. We're all in agreement on that one. There's a question about, just a very broad question, which I don't think we'll have time to get into, but is anyone looking at making government more efficient in California? The answer is yes. There are certainly independent think tanks and advocates who say, here's some ideas. We have the Little Hoover Commission in Sacramento, who of course is a sort of a critiquer and proposer of government fixes. Anything either of you would say about how sort of government efficiency may or may not figure into budgeting process?
Yeah, Scott might be able to cite actual numbers, but that was a key part of solving for this past fiscal year's budget deficit, was cutting funding for state government administration. So that was something that was proposed and included in our final budget process. And the implications of that and the actual dollar amounts, I can pass to Scott.
Okay, thanks, Laura. Off the top of my head, I can't remember the dollar. What Laura, yeah, Laura's referring to what, and so just keep in mind, everyone, when you solve a budget problem, you're solving it on paper, right? It doesn't mean that it's actually going to work out in reality. But one of the ways they closed the budget gap this year is they said, hey, for every state department, let's just impose an unallocated 8% reduction. Everybody has to figure out how to carve 8% out of their budgets. And you can guess how well this is probably landing, right? With a lot of departments saying, wait, you're telling us to cut 8%, but you're not giving us the tools to do it. How are we supposed to do this? This hasn't worked in the past when it's been tried, but we'll have to see where that goes. They've got some savings, like, I don't know, 700-800 million, I think, that they assume as part of the budget deal. So that is one thing. The other thing, just to let you know, is although I don't hear it as much from legislators, well, actually, they probably say it. There are a number of staff in the legislature, especially on the budget side, who are very concerned about wanting to spend the taxpayers' dollars wisely, right? It's not like anyone is excited about getting in there and setting money on fire, right? They know that they have limited resources to work with, and they want to know that they're spending those dollars as wisely as possible. So they also get frustrated when they hear, like, there's another state audit saying some agency hasn't spent the dollars as efficiently as they could have. So there's a lot of interest within the legislature, and especially the budget committees, in ensuring that dollars are being spent wisely and effectively. They both are, from time to time, they will hold specific hearings on this issue. The Assembly has a subcommittee that's called Oversight and Accountability or something along those lines, and they'll hold hearings on that. So it's not that no one cares about this. They really do care about it. They don't want to be wasting the taxpayers' dollars, and they know they'd rather have those dollars going into services and getting right to Californians in an effective and efficient way. It's just, I think sometimes that becomes a little bit harder, especially given the way the legislature tends to operate, which is, hey, let's introduce 3,000 bills every year and run those all through the process and keep focusing on the shiny new objects, as opposed to stepping back and really asking ourselves across a broad range of areas, where can we be doing things better and how?
Well, Robert, I know we're approaching our time limit here, so I don't want to push us. We could talk budgets for days, I think, all of us here. I want to point everyone back to the Budget Policy Center's website. There are incredible resources there. There's an explainer on the current budget. There's a lot of some of the information that Laura presented, and as well as the Women's Wellbeing Index that she referenced at the end. So there's a lot there, and we're grateful. We use the work of the center often in our work and partner, and when we're training advocates and working with advocates and colleagues, the data is important, and we're grateful for it. So I'll turn it back to you, Robert, but I want to thank both Laura and Scott for the time here. This was wonderful.
Thanks, Jeff. And thanks again, Laura and Scott, for such an informative and engaging session. As Jeff mentioned, we will be sending out a follow-up email, including all of the resources that we've referenced today, so that you can access them, reach out to Laura and Scott, and also feel free to really browse the resources that are available on their webpage. It's a wealth of information, and we'll cover many of the topics that we discussed today in greater detail. So we can move over to one of our final slides. I just wanted to give a quick plug on one of our upcoming events. I would be remiss not to tell everyone that we have a really exciting webinar coming up on the 25th next week. And this is with one of our partners, Candid, helping to tell your story with GuideStar, an important attribute and new platform that they have been rolling out. Finally, I also wanted to plug again that 15% member discount. So we're always happy to have new members. If you have questions or concerns, would like to learn more about our membership benefits, please feel free to reach out. We'd be more than happy to speak with you. Once again, thanks so much to Scott. Thanks so much to Laura. And thanks so much to Jeff for this really great webinar. We look forward to welcoming you to upcoming events and hope you have a wonderful rest of your afternoon. Take care.
Thank you.